Hello, and welcome to the Service and Bed Availability Tool, or SBAT, Intake Slot Availability Training. Please note that this training will not cover all there is to know about the SBAT. To find information about how to log on, log off, or other topics, please refer to the SBAT User Guide on the SAPC Network Provider's webpage. This training will only cover the new functionality for the SBAT that is required for providers to use effective November 18th, 2019. So let's begin by logging on to the provider site update page. It will take us to our demo agency, Recovery Inc., and you will notice that there is information that is familiar to you as well as new information, including additional intake information for outpatient services and all new information for residential services. Every day at midnight, information input into this site will revert to 0. This means that information not updated will show on the public-facing page that there is no intake or bed availability for that site. So if you want availability to show and receive external referrals, it is important that you update this information each day. The intake and bed availability information shown on this site is specific to each location. At Recovery Inc., there is only one location, and that location has both outpatient and residential services. Therefore, updates will need to be made to both outpatient and residential. If, however, Recovery Inc. had another location where only outpatient services were provided, only outpatient services would be visible on the screen. Please notice that intake slot availability is combined for both forms of outpatient as well as both for all levels of care for residential, because we're assuming that there's no separate intake. So what is new is the intake slot box, the calculator icon, and the 2 buttons to the right of your screen, all of which will be covered in this training. There are 4 different options for updating information in the SBAT functionality. The first can be used if you already know how many slots that are available. You would simply insert the number of intake slots within the box, as shown here for both outpatient and residential, and then click on the Save All button so that information will be reflected in the SBAT public-facing page. It's important to make sure that you are saving all, because otherwise the information will not be updated and will not be shown on the public-facing page. The second option for inputting information in the intake slot calculator is the intake slot calculator. The intake slot calculator can help you calculate the number of intakes that can be scheduled on a given day to maximize staff and organizational planning. You would simply click on the icon as shown here and insert the number of staff, the amount of time for each staff, the average intake time, and if you have previously scheduled intakes. Let's start with the number of staff dedicated to intakes. This is staff whose only duty for that period of time is to conduct intakes with patients. It should be a whole number. So we've input 2 here, so that means that 2 staff are only dedicated for intakes on this particular day. So then we would input the average time that each staff has to dedicate to intakes. So this would mean in this case that each of the 2 staff identified above each have 2 hours to dedicate to intake. So that's 2 hours per staff person. You can also input the average amount of intake time. It says in hours, but we look at hours in 0.25 increments. So here we have 1 hour for intake, but no, wait a second, maybe it's actually an hour and a half for each intake, or it could be an hour and a quarter. No, it's 2 hours for each intake. So it's 2 staff that have 2 hours dedicated for intake, and each intake takes 2 hours. Next, we're going to go to the existing intake appointments. This is a really flexible feature that allows providers to input if they have already scheduled intake appointments to help reflect accurate intake slot availability. In this case, Recovery Inc. has 1 intake slot available that has already been scheduled. So they have 1 intake appointment already scheduled, which means that if you look up in the intake slot box that they only have 1 intake slot available. However, this is a very flexible system, so if you change the number here, then it'll automatically update the intake slot above. So if you didn't have any intake appointments, then that would mean that you actually have 2 intake slots available. You have 2 staff who have 2 hours, and each assessment takes 2 hours, which means you have 2 intake slots. Once you are complete inputting the information, you would click on the calculator icon to remove the pop-up box. So we're going to go on to residential just to have the opportunity to show again how you would input the information. Again, now we have for residential 3 staff who are dedicated for intakes, and each staff has 2 hours to dedicate. We're kind of changing up the numbers a little bit. And so based on this information, it looks like there are 6 intake slots for residential. Apparently, a lot of people have been discharged from this residential facility, and we have several intake slots available for patients to enter into the residential facility at Recovery Inc. Again, it's important that you click on the Save All button to indicate that the information is correct. This will update the public-facing page so that people accessing the SBAT will see that there is intake slot available for each of these services on this particular day at this specific location. Now let's say that you know that the information for today's update is the same as the information from yesterday, but you kind of need to confirm what those numbers were. Well, the third option for inputting intake availability allows for this. By simply clicking on the last availability, a dashboard will pop up showing what information was input on the previous day. And you can see here that they had some availability for both outpatient and residential. They also had 1 female bed capacity. So if that is correct, you would click on the Confirm button. This would update all the information. If not, then you would click on the Cancel. But please note, if you do click on the Confirm button for last availability, both of those buttons highlighted right now will disappear. It's an error function, so it prevents errors. So by clicking on that, you would, by confirming the last availability, it will remove those 2 buttons from the page. If you need to update that, though, no worries. You would just go back to the intake slot box, input the information there, and then click on the Save All. The fourth and final option for updating intake information is the No Change button. This is used when you know you have no intake slots available for a given day. Because the SBAT intake and bed availability reverts to 0 each day at midnight, clicking on the No Change will confirm that the site has no intake availability and no bed capacity. Okay, so let's change those numbers that are currently there from the 2 and 6 to a 0. Again, so if at Recovery Inc. There is no availability for beds and there's no availability for intakes, then you could easily click on the No Change button and then save all, and then you are complete. It's a very easy function if you have no availability. However, if you have several services at one site location, by clicking on the No Change button, you are indicating that there is no availability at that site. So if at Recovery Inc., the residential has no intake and no bed availability, but the outpatient has 2 intake slots, then you should not use the No Change button. In this case, you can use the input information by hand or use the calculator or last availability function to input the actual amount of intake slots available. Again, I want to say, remember to click the Save All button. We want to call your attention to the available intakes within 7 days. This is a new feature for residential, but not for outpatient, but it is an important one. So by clicking yes on this button, it indicates that you may not have an intake slot today, but you will have an intake slot within the next 7 days. By clicking no on this button, however, you are indicating that you know that you will not have intake slots available over the next 7 days. Another really great feature is the intake hours. You click on the calculator icon and the drop box will come down with the intake hours that you have indicated prior. You can update this information by simply clicking on the box and using the drop down to click on the accurate number of intake hours for that day. This can be used if you have staffing pattern changes, and so you know that the amount of time for intakes is going to change. In this case, we've changed from 7:30 to 8, and maybe you've actually added a staff because you know that you're going to have a lot of intakes that day, and so you have longer intake hours. Conversely, you may have shorter intake hours, and so you'll want to reduce the amount of hours on a given day. And so you have the ability to do that with this intake scheduler. Again, all the information that you're making on the provider site update will be reflected in the public-facing SBAT. So it will impact your ability to receive referrals from the Substance Abuse Services Helpline and the SENS. Clicking on the calendar here will remove the pop-up box so that you can see the full summary of information. Again, I want to remind everyone to click on the Save All button to make sure that the information is saved on the public-facing SBAT page. So this then concludes the training on the SBAT intake availability functionality. This functionality will be effective November 18th, 2019 for providers to use. I want to again emphasize 3 things. One is to make sure that you are updating this information every single day. 2, to make sure that you click on the Save All button once all of the changes are made. And 3, make sure that you have correct information input because this information is reflected in the public-facing SBAT and can impact the number of referrals that you receive from the Substance Abuse Services Helpline, the Client and Engagement Navigation Services, and other referral sources that use the SBAT. Should you have any further information that you want to receive or any questions, we want to refer you to the SAPC Network Providers webpage where you can find the SBAT user guide that provides screen-by-screen information and guidance on how to use the SBAT. Thank you very much.